I think what often happens is we don't want to do all this work, so we just stay in the shallow end and we don't really name our disagreements, or we just look away. But then I think we fear, what if we get all the way to the other end? We still disagree. Can we still stay connected? I'm Trisha Taylor, and this is the Leader's Journey podcast. We're going to keep going in this series on communication. Nothing is more basic, more human, more essential to leadership than how we communicate, especially how we communicate in times of anxiety and pressure. I wrote in Learning Change that change happens at the speed of dialogue. And so a lot of this series has been about different kinds of conversation and how to engage dialogue effectively. But what about when you come to the end of the dialogue road? What about when you've said everything there is to say and they've said everything there is to say, and you still can't get on the same page? There's still not agreement. What happens then? And it was so fun to talk to my friend and colleague, Mac McCarthy, about this. It was just so rich. Our conversation was one of those that just could have gone off in any direction further. I learned some things. I know you're going to enjoy it. Mac is a very effective pastoral leader. He's also a well-respected member of our team here at the Leader's Journey. And if you want to know more about him, head over to our website, theleadersjourney.us, and you can see him listed under the tab about our team. Also, you can join Mac for a real-time conversation on this topic on, that's going to be on March 26th at 2 p.m. And we just need you to go to the website and register. That just lets us give you a unique Zoom link, so that keeps the bots out. But you can have a conversation with Mac, with other leaders who are there to learn. And so I invite you to that, encourage you to attend. And then remember that if you want to see what Mac looks like, or you want to see this conversation instead of just listening, you can also head over to YouTube. So here's my very rich and interesting conversation with Mac about what happens at the end of the dialogue road. So we've been talking for a little while about dialogue and about communication. It's that thing, that is most basic to us being human. And almost all of us think we're better at it than we are. So we've been covering some of the basics, just individually and also in organizations. And I just can't overstress what a believer I am in dialogue. I just believe in it so deeply. And I think we have to ask the question, so what happens when dialogue isn't the end? It isn't enough all by itself. So we've talked, we've listened, we've said everything there is to say. We don't have anything new to say. We're going back over the same stuff. What happens when we come to the end of the dialogue road? Then what? And I'm really grateful that you could come on today and talk about that with me. So, what happens when we reach the end of dialogue?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. When it comes to dialogue, I see two ditches, and I'll buzz over the first one quickly, because it is a common one in churches, is that we actually don't do dialogue well, which I know we've talked about. So we kind of skip due process. And I see this most common with maybe churches that have a more hierarchical leadership structure, sort of the pastor as CEO, who maybe has a lower tolerance to differing opinions. And so because of that, we can kind of skip over giving decisions or conversations the time that they require. And we jump right into sort of issuing a mandate or a thus saith the Lord moment. And that's a ditch I certainly want to avoid, where we don't give conversations or dialogue the space that they actually require.
Yeah.
But I think you're
I think
asking a
what
different.
I see sometimes is the leader will say, we're opening this up for dialogue, and three people get to say something, and then the leader tells them why they're wrong, and then
Yes.
we move on. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That would be an example, I think, of the first ditch, which is sort of
Yeah.
skipping due process, or faking dialogue, pretending we had it and we actually didn't. And I do think it's fairly common, and we need to be aware of that. I think you're asking a different question, which is, but what happens if we have given it due process? We've given it plenty of
Yeah.
space, and it feels like giving it more space isn't the next right move, right? Like,
Yes.
now what?
Yeah,
And
maybe it comes out of a story. I think the first time I started to notice this was when we got brought in to help a network of churches through a major conflict, a church, a group splitting kind of conflict. And they brought us in, and the idea was help this group that is going to help make the decision going forward get on the same page. And where we started with them was there's no page. I mean, you've said everything. You've had your study groups, you've had your focus groups, you've put people in rooms together to work this out, and you're not going to get on the same page. So what happens next?
yes, and I think that is the stuck point, is this belief that more dialogue will inevitably or eventually lead to being on the same page. And I think the assumption underneath your question, and I think it's rooted in reality, is that isn't always the case. That more dialogue isn't necessarily going to reach agreement, mean we reach consensus or agreement, if we've heard everything each other has to say, and we just define ourselves differently. And as at the leader's journey, that's part of what we train people to do, is to own what they think, what they value, what they believe, what they will and won't do. And so if we're really doing that well in a group, there are going to be these moments where we've defined ourselves and we're different. And now what?
Yeah.
And now what? And the second ditch, though, is getting stuck in that endless pursuit of consensus or agreement,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is really common, and especially more in flat leadership environments. So if ditch one, sort of skipping due process or faking dialogue, is, I think, tied more to a hierarchical approach, the pendulum can swing. And I've certainly experienced this, where all of a sudden we move to more of a flat leadership structure where we all have a voice, we all have input, and we can get stuck in this place where, hey, if we're going to make a decision, we really have to agree. We're not going to move forward unless we really have consensus. And in my experience, that leads to a tyranny of the minority. So a tyranny of the majority is where the concerns and perspectives of the majority rule to the neglect of the voice of the minority.
Yeah.
This is a reverse of that, where really a small group or even a single individual can block forward movement because everyone must agree before making a decision or acting. And this, in my experience, actually puts a lot of power in the hands of a single person, and from a systems viewpoint, can even reward resistance.
Mm. Rewarding resistance. In other words, giving too much influence
That's
to
right.
to the to those who are resisting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we need to reach agreement in order to make a decision or move forward, all it takes is one person to disagree, and they can sort of hold the group hostage.
Yeah.
Maybe an example of this for us, the first ditch, in my experience, the first ditch I've named was really common underneath my predecessor. Our governing board at the time was basically a group of rubber stampers. They would just rubber stamp whatever our pastor said we were going to do. And it was very much a CEO sort of structure. He's the CEO and we follow his lead. After he left and I took over, I began to swing more to what I would call a polycentric leadership structure. So a group of people leading together. And I think early on, many of us had the assumption that that meant consensus, that when we would make decisions, it would be made as a group, And the result of making decisions as a group would have been a sense of we're unanimous in the outcome. I remember after COVID, or at least during COVID, one of the things that many churches had to navigate was the PPP funding.
Oh, yeah.
To help offset some of the employee stuff. And our governing board at that time had some political diversity on it. It still does, but we had some that were very resistant to receiving any of that aid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we had some who were definitely in favor of it.
And everybody had their good reasons, I assume.
Yes, but the two who were had the strongest opinion about not receiving it took up the most airtime. Whereas I think the vast majority said, I think we're sitting on opinions that they should receive it. We should receive it. And what we ended up doing, it was sort of like, this is where consensus gets messy, is instead of everybody defining themselves and then letting the decision where it lands, we tried to appease the two people who said, we don't feel comfortable with this. And the agreement we made as a leadership team is we're going to receive it for this season, but we're going to pay it back.
Okay.
So that was kind of like the compromise, but it was clearly done to appease these two board members who felt really strongly that this wasn't a thing we should be doing.
And so on the one hand, we really value this idea that everybody gets a voice, not necessarily, more than one vote, but everybody gets to say their piece, and we genuinely want to listen, and we genuinely want to hear the dissenting opinions, and we don't want to just shift into convincing. We also want to compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, at some point, we get to the end of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
At some point, we get to the end of that. And at least with that decision, myself and the chairman of our leadership team, when we sort of got past the decision months later, that resurfaced. And I said, you know what? I don't think we did a great job facilitating that decision. And I'm concerned we made some agreements that I don't feel good about following through because of that. And so we actually went back to the leadership. Yeah. And so we went back to the leadership team and revisited how that decision was made. And I narrated what I noticed from where I was sitting. I said, I've had a number of board members come and express that they didn't define themselves well in that moment, but we sort of catered to these two voices. And I think we actually need to go back and revisit that decision we've made, not to overturn it, but to have a new dialogue and make sure we give everybody permission to define their own values and what they think. And we did that and then re-voted on it.
Do you think part of what was happening was, just a strong sense of wanting there to be togetherness, wanting there to be that sense of we're all on the same page, even if we're not? Or was there something else going on? What do you see?
No, I think that's exactly what it was, is that, again, there was this, I think, assumption that following God's lead as a team would lead to a unanimous decision. And the only way we were able to get there was through compromise, actually compromising our self-definition. And then when we went back and revisited it, I said, everybody needs to define themselves and then vote based on how they see it. And we didn't have a unanimous decision. The two people who felt strongly still voted no, but the vast majority voted yes. And that ended up being a celebration for at least me that people define themselves. And now we can attend to the aftermath of that decision. What does it look like to create space for those who need to grieve or express sadness that it didn't go their way, right? What does it look like for us to wrestle through unity without there being uniformity around a decision? So it opened up new areas, I think, of growth for us as a team that I think don't happen if we're sort of hiding what we really think in the name of unity.
I have at least a couple of times when the group had to share their decision back with the congregation, I've suggested a minority opinion. as part of the report back, um, so that those people get to say, this is how we saw it in a brief, but, hopefully a way that really reflects how they see things. There are certainly other times I would not do that. But, to represent that we are unified, even though here are some disparate opinions. Um, yeah.
And I think that's really helpful, maybe for some of our pastors who are listening. Those moments are often the most powerful ones for your board members and your church when you represent a minority view and are able to, with maturity, submit to a decision made by everybody else and show what it looks like to, quote unquote, not get your way, can speak volumes and provide some positive vision for everybody else when they're put in that decision, that same position.
I've learned a lot about this from a Quaker pastor that I worked with
Hmm.
years and years ago, because of their commitment to not voting on things, but instead, waiting in the
Mm-hmm.
spirit
Mm-hmm.
until, something emerges. And I've seen several different iterations of that. And I just think it's so fascinating. But the idea that there is an expectation that the spirit might say to someone who's sitting, um, stand aside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the answers. That's one of the legitimate approaches. That if you're trying to discern the Spirit of God and everybody else seems to be going in another
Mm-hmm.
direction, that you express clearly and compellingly how you see it. And then you make, publicly announce that you're standing aside.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this. We have another TLJ teammate who has some influence in the Quaker realm, and we've had some dialogue about this. And
That's
we have a process. Our team, our staff team, and our leadership team has a process in writing that we use. It's not a technique, but it's some guardrails and some guidelines for us to follow in making complex decisions. And there is some overlap. We spend a lot of time listening in prayer,
mm,
trying to discern what God might be saying. And one of the things I tell people who are entering our team for the first time is there have been many occasions where, despite spending lots of time listening, I do not sense anything. Sometimes I do, but many times I don't. And one of the things I sense in that not hearing anything is that God is intentionally not giving me a nudge or a sense in order to give it to other people that then I can submit to.
mm. That is such a different mental model than the idea that we all get in there and tangle with each other and express our opinions and then we vote. It's just a different way of looking at the process.
Yes, and maybe to go back to that story I shared about some of the COVID decisions in our board, that was more of the framework. It was less agenda pushing and voting. It was in the context of listening and praying. And yet, despite that, despite our collective listening, we still had different opinions.
Which flies in the face of what I think is by far the dominant mental model, which is one, if God is speaking, there will be unanimity. You
Yeah,
know,
if it seems good to us and the Holy Spirit, done.
yeah, right. um, and that anyone who doesn't go along with that is a threat,
Mm-hmm.
you know, is that somehow we need to find a way to either get them on board or how do we stay connected to them? They're obviously not as fill in the blank, as spiritual, as easy to get along with, as committed, whatever it is, as we are, as we in the majority are.
Mm-hmm.
And and so one of the things that I'm thinking about is the the structure around that or the process. I mean, you said I've seen your team in action.
Mm-hmm.
I Y'all are the real deal and you do what you're saying. Um, and I just wonder, yeah, how do we set the container? How do we create the container so that it can go the way you're describing?
I'm still learning here, so I'm not giving a definitive answer. Just here's what we've done is I've just created a document that outlines, here's our posture when making decisions, and it just kind of maps out. We're trying to reach a posture of indifference to everything but God's will. In other words, we want to become aware of our wants and desires, but in the end, this is our goal. It's to discern what God might have us do. And so we're sort of setting the focus as discerning the Spirit's leading rather than trying to get my way.
Really?
And then I have just a process to support that. So oftentimes when we make a decision or are trying to make a decision, we will set the presenting issue at the center and then maybe leave for a week committing to pray about it. And then when we come back together, I will facilitate. And I will often say, I want everybody to take 5 minutes and write down what they sense or define themselves. And I have them do that before listening to anybody else so they can't change what they think or believe based on what they're hearing from someone else. And I usually don't share. At least if I do share, I'm the last one. And that's really important because I feel like my voice often carries a lot of weight. And so I will spend most of my leadership chips facilitating rather than giving input. And so we just go around. And oftentimes there have been occasions where we all define ourselves the same way. And those are the easy ones. And that's awesome. Sometimes that's not the case. And so we'll have to spend some time engaging in deep listening to one another around those differences, and then I'll open it up for another round of listening. Let's just sit for 5 minutes with all that we've discussed and try another round of defining ourselves. With the hopes that, hey, maybe we are getting closer. Maybe we're in process here and we're kind of moving towards a greater consensus. But there have been occasions where no matter how many iterations, no matter how many times we go around, we're just at an impasse. And it's not because one person is following Jesus and the others aren't, or one person wants to honor the Bible or be faithful to Scripture and that person doesn't. We all give each other the benefit of the doubt, and yet here we are.
So that part seems so crucial, that we're willing to relate to each other in good faith and assume that they're relating to us in good faith.
Yes.
And yet here we are. One of the things I almost always do with a group that has to make a decision. Now, not all these dialogues are about having to come to a decision, but for the ones that are, I strongly encourage them, decide how you're going to decide before you even know what you think. And I see you nodding.
Yes.
And what's funny to me is if I'm facilitating it, I can make that happen. If I'm not the one that's facilitating, I'm only advising that. I have found they almost never do that. They don't take one. So how do y'all decide how to decide?
This is where I'm so indebted to the chairman of our leadership team. He was a judge for 30 years and so is very accustomed to what we're talking about, which is like trying to observe and take in all the data to inform a decision. Having exhausted all of the listening, there comes a point in which a quote unquote verdict needs to be made. I need to make a decision and deal with whatever transpires next. And that's been a gift. But part of that process in working with him he's always advocated for a clear process for making a decision and who makes that decision. And the reason why is because when you're making a crucial decision and emotions are involved or different agendas are at play, we don't want the process to be skewed or lack integrity because then it becomes a barrier. And so if we can agree on a process that has integrity on the front end, then it can positively strengthen our decision as we move through it because it's being done with integrity and fairness. And so there have been many times where we've had to pause, maybe take a month or two to go, hey, this is a decision and the decision-making lane isn't clear to me. Is this a leadership team decision? Is this a staff decision? Who makes the decision? Because that could become an issue of tension, unneeded tension, or conflict if there's ambiguity down the road. And so even though it's tedious, we have working documents around here are the types of decisions our leadership team makes, and here are the types of decisions our staff team makes, and here's a process when there needs to be some collaboration between the two.
And you're doing that at the beginning. You're front
At the
loading all
beginning.
of that
Yep,
before you know who's likely to, as you said earlier, get their way. Before you even get into that, you
that's right. So that
you're
way, if we do get into it, let's say it's a staff decision and we have a leadership team member who's really cranked up about it, hypothetically, we can say, I see your concern. Tell me your input. Like, I'm going to always listen. And I want you to know that let's go back to this process we outlined. This is a staff decision. So know that your
yes.
voice is always welcome, but this is who owns that decision and here's why.
And that clarity. I mean, it doesn't mean there won't be hurt feelings. It doesn't mean the gears won't grind sometimes, but that clarity at the beginning, this is who owns this decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so important.
Yeah. One of the biggest lessons I learned and it came with some bumps and bruises. Because again, we went from more of a pretty hierarchical culture to wanting to be a polycentric leadership team. And I think the pendulum may have overswung for a little bit in the direction of being too flat.
Mm-hmm.
And as the lead pastor, I had several situations and still do where I'm making a decision with a team. It's clear we're reaching the end of the dialogue road. And because we have a stated value around team leadership, there's this underlining assumption that our voice or our input has equal weight. And there were a number of painful decisions or painful situations where I realized that is a really bad assumption that I'm not operating out of. In other words, equal say, meaning we all have an opportunity to say what we see from where we sit, with unequal responsibility is problematic. And I found myself in a situation where I'm listening to all the leaders around me, and they think they have an equal voice to me, and yet they don't bear the responsibility for executing the decisions that we make. And I was sort of left with, I basically have a team of advisors that I need to persuade or convince in order to act on my convictions as a leader. And it took me a while to put my finger on it and go, oh, we all have an opportunity to say where, like, here's what I see from where I sit. But that equal say doesn't mean our input is equal. Our input needs to be based on who has responsibility here for this decision. So circling back to what you were saying, the process needs to help us see who has authority to make this decision. The person making the decision also should have the greatest input over that decision so they can actually own it.
And that should be stated and defined up front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give you a live example that I'm in the middle of right now with my leadership team. Many churches, every church is having to navigate, how do I engage this political climate?
Mm-hmm.
And our leadership team, we've worked together long enough to have a shared vision of how we approach moments that require something to be said from the stage. And as a rough framework, we refuse or avoid being fused to the political right, the political left, or the center. Those are not our pivots. Okay. Our desire is to be a faithful presence and witness to the kingdom of God in our current political moment. Now, there's all kinds of questions about what that looks like in any given moment. And we're aware that when there's different cultural moments, different political ideologies expect different things. So, for instance, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, the political right wanted us to lionize him as a martyr. And those who had a more left-leaning ideology didn't see him that way and would have been offended if we had done that. When Alex Preddy was killed in Minneapolis, maybe those who are more left-leaning wanted us to really bring some outcry to that moment. Whereas those on the right were probably going, hey, no, those were cops doing their job. Like, that isn't what we're pivoting out of to virtue signal to either party or to just stay in the center and not try to offend anybody.
Yeah.
Okay. I've noticed, and this is me being pretty vulnerable, I've noticed that trying to be a faithful presence in this cultural moment means I hold more tension than other pastors who are fused. So if someone is fused to the right and they regularly speak that way from the pulpit, chances are they have a community that's fairly right-leaning, and they don't have to sit in the tension of how to communicate when these moments, because the script is being handed to them and it's being welcomed by the community they're a part of.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
The environment I'm in is very much like, yes, we want to be kingdom-centered, we want to be Jesus-centered, and we don't want to offend people if we don't have to.
Okay.
And I've realized that has, over time, from a systems perspective, really caused me to overfunction emotionally for our congregation, to avoid creating a negative response in someone else that actually I'm not responsible for.
Yeah.
I end up bearing most of the emotional weight of these moments so as not to offend. And in a way that, for me at least, feels crippling to actually pointing to, with a certain degree of kingdom clarity, the ethics of Jesus in some of these moments. What's more is I've come to the realization that some of the ways that I've tried to navigate publicly don't match the way Jesus navigates publicly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so I've brought this before our leadership team. You expect me to sort of navigate these really sensitive moments publicly in a way that actually doesn't match how Jesus engaged publicly. He often chose sides publicly. He didn't say things that were crystal clear and sensitive to everybody who's present. He said things, as Eugene Peterson, he told it slant. He often said and did things that were really confusing.
Yes.
Yes.
Aversive. And yeah.
Right. So,
and left the decision about how to hear it with the hearer.
Yes. So I know this is a lot of setup to say this. I'm currently working with our leadership team on a document that names some of our guiding principles about how and when we say things from the stage, so that when these things happen, we have a shared set of convictions that guide us. So we're not responding to other people's anxiety, but we're responding to our best thinking. But I recently told them in a meeting, I'm not looking for a consensus about what these guiding principles should be.
Okay.
And the reason why is because you don't ever have to stand up and say these things.
Yeah.
I do.
Right.
I'm the one who has to give voice to these things in these really sensitive moments. I'm the one who has people come up to me afterwards, either thanking me or upset with me. Like, you don't have to do that. So I'm hoping we can reach a reasonable level of alignment around these. But in the end, I'm not asking for permission.
And you're clear about that. To me, that's the most important thing. You're clear about that. I think there are some leaders, senior leaders, who are going to say, I mean, they don't mean to say this, but they lead as if, look, this is my job. I'm doing it. You're lucky I let you talk. You're lucky that I get input. And then on the other end of the spectrum, leaders who are uncomfortable in their authority and who act like every decision is going to be a consensus, when actually it's not. And that's confusing to people. They don't understand. They feel like there's a bait and switch. I thought I not only had a say, but I had a vote. And they find out that's not the case in kind of a passive aggressive way. And what I hear you saying is that y'all are working really hard on getting all the input you can. I mean, you're not wrestling with this by yourself. You're doing it with your team, and being really clear at the end of the day, this is a decision that you'll make because these guiding principles have to be consistent for you.
Yeah. And I'm the one who bears the responsibility for executing them. Yes. And your input matches the fact that what I say, oftentimes you have to support, because people, if they're concerned, will come to you as well. So I can't gloss over that. I can't pretend like I can say whatever I want and then you just have to back me up. which is
Yeah.
why you're also sitting at this table and we're working together.
And so then that brings me to what it's like to be in this kind of dialogue discernment process when you're not the final decision maker.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot, I'm not the first person to say this, but I think there's a lot of value, just like in learning to be a good leader, learning to be a good follower. What is it like for me when I'm in a dialogue, discernment, decision making process like this to ask at the beginning? It would help me to know who's going to own this decision before we
Mm-hmm.
get started,
Mm-hmm.
or to be ready to say, if there is consensus, but not unanimity, am I willing to say, I trust these people that I'm making this decision with? Even if I think they're wrong, I trust us to figure that out. And the kind of maturity and humility and trust that takes a long time to build. And I want to be sure our listeners know that you have been building this a long time.
Yeah, this didn't happen overnight. This is years. I mean, you say, hey, you're speaking with clarity, but that's because of the bumps and bruises along the road and the tensions that bubbled up where I'm going, this isn't working. People are getting frustrated. How do I name this? It's required a lot of work.
And there's been some cost. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there have been people, and we would predict this, right? There have been people who've said, I don't want to keep talking about this, or I don't care what your guiding principles are, or I just, I am so convinced of my rightness, I can't stay. I have to go to find other people who are right on this issue, for example. And there has sometimes been a cost to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe one recommendation I would make to anybody who's listening who's going, I want to continue to build capacity myself and in my leadership in this area. One of the big shifts for me has been really a shift in focus. And I would narrate that shift of focus by distinguishing between content, the content of the decision that's being made, and the process or the emotional dynamic as we're making it.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I think most people, when we're in a room trying to make a decision, we focus on content,
Mhm.
the pros and cons, and we go back and forth.
Yeah.
But I would say if you're going to make progress as a team in how to do this, maybe I'm just making up a percentage. I probably am. But my guess would be at least 80% of your focus needs to be on how are we making this decision and relating to each other as we do.
Yes. Okay, so back to this original story that kind of got me thinking about this. I think once everyone was able to see, we cannot get to a place where we all see this the same way. We are not going to agree. Then the questions shifted to how will we be together? How, as we accept our
Mhm.
disagreement, how will we walk that out?
Yes.
Will we punish the ones who disagree? Do the people who have the most power or the money get to call the shots? Will we create a path for people who can't stay to leave with dignity? Will we
Mm-hmm.
create a path for those who do stay to to do that in a healthy way? Um,
Yep.
how
And
do we
there's a,
keep people from putting their foot on the neck of
yeah.
the
Yeah.
minority and so
I,
forth?
th- yeah, I think one great exercise you could do that we've done as a team is to get a whiteboard out and ask your leadership team those questions.
Mm,
Who do we want to be? If we're at our best, I've done this with our leadership team where I'll say, like, at our best, at our worst, kind of in the middle. If we don't get our way, what would it look like to embody maturity at our best and at our worst? And so
exactly.
you develop kind of a roadmap to go, here's what it looks like. And
Mm,
that way we have a shared understanding when these moments come to go, hey, remember we talked about it? Well, now is the time where we actually live into it.
mhm. Yes, and that's already been spoken early in the process, and you can reference it.
That's right.
And then I'm so assuming that then becomes part of the prayerfulness, for example. we're asking God to make us into people who can live up to that commitment.
Yep.
It's so counterintuitive. I mean, almost none of us have this way of doing things in our first formation or in our seminary training or our education or in just our experience in the world and how things are done. And yet, I really do believe that when we can, I'm so glad you mentioned the first ditch, because I think what often happens is we don't want to do all this work. So we just stay in the shallow end
Hmm.
and we don't really name our disagreements, or we just look away. But then I think we fear, what if we get all the way to the other end
Hmm.
and we still disagree? Can we still stay connected?
Yeah.
So we've defined ourselves all the way around. We've watched the process. We've made sure that everyone had a chance to participate. We've watched kind of how power dynamics have played out with all of that. Can we still walk away connected to each other, which is often our deepest value? That's what we most want. And losing that is what we most fear. And
Yep.
I just continue to believe that there is a way to do that.
I think so. I think that when you do this work, it's going to get messy. Um, but it's also where the greatest transformation comes, which again is why you can't just focus on the content of the decision, but who are we becoming as we make the decision. Because at the center of these messy conversations are invitations for transformation.
Mm.
And so your job as a leader, yes, is to make wise decisions with the people around you, but it's also to attend to their growth and their maturity and your own
And
along
just,
the way.
yeah.
I have a distinct memory when I first became the lead pastor. I was 35 years old. I was the youngest person sitting at the decision making table by at least 25 years.
Mm.
And we had a moment where a business owner, he was an entrepreneur, started his own company, wildly successful and really used to getting his way, didn't get his way. And he let everybody know at the table and threatened to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a pout fest.
Which is fairly predictable. I mean, anyone
Yes.
listening to this that has ever served on any kind of a team has either done that or witnessed that.
Yes. So it was a full on, I'm used to getting my and calling the shots. I can't believe this isn't happening. Pushed away from the table. I'm not even sure I want to be part of this team anymore. And everybody sort of rushed to save the moment because they didn't want him to leave. And I said, let's get lunch tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And, by then he had cooled down a little bit. But I kind of said two things. I said, that's not what we do. Not at this table. We don't throw tantrums because we don't get our way. That's a sign of immaturity. I just named it. I know
Mm-hmm.
I'm young. You may not
Well,
respect me, but that's not who we are at our best. And that wasn't you at your best.
hmm.
And so I wanna like not guilt or shame you, but I want to be the kind of person who tells the truth and then loves you to do the next right thing. And I think what you need right now is space to grieve that it didn't go your way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that I think is a skill when it comes to how can we stay connected. It's calling people into maturity, but then also recognizing, hey, when we don't get our way, it stinks. And so what is the leadership skill that's needed? It's to know how to guide people into lament.
Mm. To name that grief and to make it okay for people to feel that way and to give them space for that, as long as we all understand how we function together.
Yeah,
Who
and
we are.
oftentimes the barrier for me is not only do I want to have like conformity or consensus around this decision, but I want everybody to be happy about it.
Yeah,
And
right.
so, right? So if we don't agree, I have to have the internal maturity to go, this person can have their own emotional response to this decision. They don't have to like it. And
Yeah.
I have to give them permission to feel what they need to feel.
And what occurs to me is that some people will not be capable of doing that. And that has to be a reality we as leaders have to accept.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are not going to, at their current level of capacity, they're not going to be capable of hearing someone say to them, hey, that wasn't you at your best. And I want to give you some space to,
Mm-hmm.
to handle that the decision didn't go your way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which takes us back to, I mean, that's one really good example of what it means to be both defined and connected. The corollary to that would be, and I know you have this capacity, but your ability to do the same thing when someone
Mm-hmm.
comes to you and says that wasn't you at your best,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to give you some space to figure out how to do the right thing. I think I want to finish up with this idea that, first of all, no one has to do things the way you do them.
Mm-hmm.
But the basic concepts here are really strong and are worth adapting to our own leadership style. I think the other thing is we have to turn loose of. So I don't know exactly why it works this way, but our nervous systems are literally designed to perceive difference as threat.
Yep.
And so even though we get all the way through the dialogue, our nervous systems are always hoping that we'll end up the same. And when that doesn't happen, at least for me, my discipleship in part is, do I default to my nervous system
Mm-hmm.
or do I default to my discipleship?
Mm-hmm.
And do I find a way to stay connected even when not only do I disagree, but let me say that a little stronger. I think you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what does our relationship look like on the other side of that?
Yeah.
This is why I always love having conversations with you on the podcast, because we get to have these conversations sometimes, but nobody gets to hear the things that you say. And so I always know it's going to be rich and it's going to be practical. I appreciate that. Let me just say to our listeners, you can find Mac on the Leaders Journey website, theleadersjourney.us. We also want to hear from you. Facebook page, Instagram, comment there. Tell us what you think. We want to hear. And as always, we hope you will take care, and we'll see you next time.